Will of Despair is an archetype with their own grim-like ruler, Book of Dark. It's a darkness ruler that can pay any color will to play Will of Despair cards. You also cannot run cards with Will of Hope as a symbol skill in your deck when using it. It has an X cost for Judgment and turns into Lapis Story, Subjugation Fairy Tale. It has the same Any Will ability along with This Card Cannot Be Destroyed. Lapis Story also brings in a Will of Despair resonator from outside the game into your field with total cost less than or equal to the amount you paid for its Judgment. Then, if that resonator leaves the field, Lapis Story will flip back over to its ruler side. It's an interesting mechanic and brings a cool toolbox element that the game hasn't really had. I've talked about how I love toolboxes before, and Will of Despair fits the mold for it a bit better than its sibling type, Will of Hope. The Will of Despair cards don't have many combos with each other, but instead can deal with a variety of situations depending on what is happening in the game. There's also an unfortunate amount of weaker cards in the archetype since it was split between two rulers, with the Seven Kings and some of the other resonators in the set being playable with corrupted Yggdrasil instead. But this stuff is easier to explain bit by bit than it is trying to collectively talk about the whole gimmick without examples. So let's get into this resonator-heavy archetype. The first and only one cost to spare resonator is Risheberos, the Devilish Brute. He's a 3/3 Darkness resonator with the ability to pay 200 life to boost him by 1/1 till the end of turn. This can be done a total of 3 times per turn. His ability's pretty okay. Having a 6/6/1 cost isn't too bad, you're gonna feel that 600 life though. And he's a beast, so he'll work with Call to Action, but at the same time he doesn't really gel with the rest of the archetype. You'll probably notice with a lot of cards in this archetype that their effects really spread out and are varied, and not a lot of them interact with each other like I said before. A good chunk of Despair cards have life pay requirements, and most of them are better than Brute. This is because they go with the corrupted Yggdrasil ruler rather than the Book of Dark ruler, who can get away with using life as a resource, since that's not how you're going to kill him. Brute is actually kind of funny in decks where you want to turbo out Dark Red Riding Hood or Snow White though, but he's pretty bad in his actual gimmick. Moving on to 2-cost resonators, we start with Ahriman, the Wicked Spirit Eye. He's a 5/7 water resonator with the ability to force your opponent to show their hand, but only during your turn. This guy really isn't that good. For a will cheaper, you can play any discard spell and get roughly the same effect, if not better, since your opponent is going to lose a card. His stats aren't terrible, but they make him hard to argue playing when he lacks a symbol skill like flying to back them up. Seriously, what is it with this game and not giving things with wings flying? I mean, come on guys. Moving on, up next is Sun Wukong, Enforcer for the Future. He's a Wind Resonator with 6/5 stats, flying, and the ability to return a non-Magic Stone, non-J Resonator to its owner's hand. In this format, that limits him exclusively to tokens and additions. There really isn't too much of a need for this guy, since Will of Despair doesn't really care about a lot of meta-relevant additions. Although I guess you could use him with the new Magic Crest additions for some gimmicky enter effects. Rizard, King of the Damned, is a 5/5 Darkness Resonator that has the ability to pay 200 life to remove a card in any graveyard from the game. He also gains 1/1 for every Resonator that is currently in its owner's removed area. This guy's actually not that bad. He's a staple in any anti-Fox or anti-Reanimator deck since he can remove any Killing Stone that goes to the graveyard before Kitsune King can grab them, and likewise he can remove anything that gets targeted to be brought back from the graveyard. The effect isn't once per turn, so you can continually do it with your opponent until they've exhausted all their recovery options and they just eventually lose the battle. Rizard's effects are much better suited for Yggdrasil, which is something you'll notice for a lot of cards that pay life. Also, why the hell is this man not a vampire force of will? You could throw the archetype a bone, but I guess you'd rather just see them boned. Our final monocolor 2-cost is the Mei Cao Sisters. They're a 5/5 Darkness Resonator with a multitude of effects. They can tap themselves to either destroy a Resonator with 200 attack or less, drain 200 life from your opponent and give it to you, or move a 1/1 counter from another Resonator onto themselves. They're okay, but maybe a little slow. It's obvious they tried to put all the effects of the original Sisters on this card, but they kinda dropped the ball with Rinka, whose ability involves removing and using 1/1 counters to gain symbol skills. It wouldn't make sense to have a tap ability to remove a counter for something, but you could give them ability to tap and gain a counter, which would at least let them sort of scale into mid-game. These next 2 Resonators are the real crux of Will of Despair, and any other deck you can put them in. I'm speaking about Lars, Swordsmen of the Dusk, and Sylvia, Blade of the Supreme King. Both of them are 2-cost swiftness resonators with some of the best effects on aggro cards. Lars comes with first strike, so he'll always do damage first when attacking, but he can also swap his attack and defense around, which lets him potentially live through combat on your opponent's turn. Sylvia has the ability to prevent a J resonator from blocking, which can be disgustingly overpowered with a field full of strong threats when your opponent has nothing. These two are easily at 4 each in just about any build of Will of Despair. They give you a nice aggressive early game and can take out threats and prevent your opponent from going too wide. Arla, Demonic Flying Ace, is the first 3-cost resonator. He has 7/8 for stats and comes with flying. He also has an active ability to pay 200 life to deal 200 damage to an attacking or blocking resonator. This guy is an okay tech in Will of Despair, but he really shines in hard control like Zero, Rhea, or Yggdrasil. Hell, he works better in Lumia decks since he can capitalize off her innate life gain when she swings. If anything, I say run him at 2. You can pull from the side deck if you really need him, but a lot of Will of Despair decks are going to focus more on the aggro side of things. The next 3-cost is Melge, King of Black Flame. He's a 7/7 resonator with swiftness and can pay 300 life to gain an additional 100 attack and first strike until the end of turn. Melge is a great 3-cost for aggro decks, mostly because he can be used to end games quickly if your opponent doesn't have a response to him hitting the field. Paying life matters little if you know you can close out the game or even get rid of a pesky boss monster with him. He's definitely a 3-of in a Will of Despair aggro deck, because you can at least stick one in the side to end the game if you really need him. The next few 3-costs are where things start to fall apart a bit. First is Luna, Magician of the Moonstar. She's an 8/8 water resonator that comes with a built-in mana counter ability that she can use to pay for Ancient Magic Chance. She can only produce water though, so her options are a little limited when it comes to the cheaper Ancient Magic cards. Honestly, I don't feel like she's that good. Ancient Heartfelt Fire gives a very similar benefit for 1/3 of the cost, and the game really isn't in a state where you can expect a lot of your important resources to stay on the board. She doesn't synergize that well with any Will of Despair resonator, and she's kinda just here for lore reasons, I guess. I mean, she's pretty cool with Mercurius if you can land the Rising combo and put her on the field that way, and I guess she does give a little extra space for Alhamat to make use of mana counters. But otherwise, you're not going to use her in anything else. The next 3-cost is Scheherazade, Speaker of Yet Unknown Truths. She has similar stats to Luna, but comes with Quick Cast, and can target a resonator when she enters the field and deny it the ability to attack, block, or use its active abilities. I guess she's okay against other aggro decks, but I can't think of a situation where she would help in hand over better options. This is a card that needs barrier on the turn she's played to be actually effective. If she had it all the time, that would be busted as hell with her stat spread, but having some form of built-in protection would at least guarantee you stop a Maria Bello without having her just blow up Scheherazade in response. The last disappointing 3-cost is Mikage Seijuro, Patriarch of the Vampires. Same 8/8 spread as Luna and Scheherazade, and he also comes with Quick Cast. His ability to enter lets you pay any amount of life in chunks of 100, and then remove an equal amount of attack from all J resonators your opponent controls until the end of the turn. He also gains a 1/1 counter anytime a resonator goes from your opponent's field to the graveyard, because that's the stupid vampire gimmick in Lapis. Seijuro would actually be a really good control card if his ability was permanent and didn't last until the end of the turn. He could pretty much invalidate any aggro deck alone, but sadly I guess that was not meant to be. Alright, back to the kinda good resonators. First up is Abdulallah, Sinister Vizier. He's a 7/8 darkness resonator that forces your opponent to discard every time a darkness magic stone enters your field. I wouldn't build a deck around this guy because of his cost, but he certainly makes a good 1 or 2 of if you're lacking in options for control. Although in all honesty, you probably won't be. He works with cards like Demonic Orderly, so you have other ways to abuse his ability outside of calling stones. I guess you could hard commit resources to Blinking Orderly for consistent discards, but chances are your opponent will have probably finished setting up their field by the time you'll be able to do this combo effectively. The next 3-cost is what I would argue is one of the best cards in the game. Force of Will doesn't have that many surge cards, let alone ones that can build up decent bulk and help you circumvent extra costs. Gil Lapis, Usurper of Maddening Power, is a 6/7 light dark resonator that lets you search out a 1-cost light or darkness chant and add it to your hand when he enters the field. He lets you play chants that cause you to lose life without having that effect go through. Gains an additional 1/1 for each other Will of Despair you control, and also comes with precision. The search ability alone makes this guy worth playing, since the lineup of darkness chants you can grab is pretty wide. There's some gimmicky stuff you can grab out of light, but you'll more often than not see yourself facing a final battle or a discard card after he's been played. There are only 2 4-cost resonators, and the first is Bahamut the Dragonoid. He's a 5/5 fire resonator that can either burn a J resonator for 1k on entry, or he can put 5 1/1 counters on himself when he enters. He gains flying as long as he has a 1/1 counter. I mean, it's not the worst removal. It's certainly not the best, but also not the worst. He's fun to abuse with Lumia, but then again there's a better version of him that was printed not even 2 sets prior that does a better job at his gimmick. I want to like this guy, but he's just really, really lackluster, especially when the other 4-cost Will of Despair is leagues better than he is. Speaking of, that other 4-cost is Viola, Vengeful Ebon Dragon. She's a red-black resonator with swiftness and flying that destroys one other resonator whenever she attacks. So she seems a little lackluster as a 4-cost at first glance, since there's another 4-cost swiftness flyer in the same cluster that's 200 attack and defense stronger, but much of Viola's value comes from her ability, which, by the way, doesn't list a target, so fuck off, barrier. The only 5-cost resonator is Yid Beast of Disaster. He's a 9/9 win resonator that can be played from your removed area for 3 void will less, so he wasn't really designed to be used with book as much as he was with the tree. He falls into the same category as Luna, where their splash as a Will of Despair has less to do with archetypal support and more to do with lore. Blazing right along, there are 2 7-cost resonators, Umur and Valentina. Umur is your combo maker, and his stats might as well not matter because the important thing is his enter ability, which states that you can grab a 1, 2, and 3-cost resonator addition from your deck and put them in the field, which hilariously means you can grab a bunch of stupidly strong swiftness resonators for cheap, or even grab Alexandria if you're a cheeky bastard and give him swiftness instead. This guy is good in Will of Despair and also in decks that can make use of things like Rising, or Moonbeam Butterfly, which can cheat him out really easily from almost anywhere. Valentina is an 8/9 water darkness resonator who can be played for 1 void less for each resonator currently in your graveyard. She doesn't have any enter effects, but she can bring back a resonator from your graveyard once per turn at the start of your turn. The main downside to Valentina is that she doesn't get her effect immediately or at the whim of the player. Hell, I would accept banishing her to get something back over her current ability. At least then my opponent would have less of a chance to interact. She's a fun tech in Reanimator decks, but her 8/9 body doesn't offset her cost, and the sluggishness of her effect makes her susceptible to removal. There's also the fact that there's a hard counter to her in her own archetype, so I don't know. The last Will of Despair resonator is Yamata No Orochi, the Reincarnated Calamity. It's a 0/16 fire resonator with a total cost of 8. It comes built in with swiftness and an enter effect that does 800 damage to every other resonator. It also does 8 damage to every other resonator and your opponent whenever it attacks. This guy is a game closer, much like Umur is. His ability will undoubtedly clear your field along with your opponent's, but who cares if your opponent is dead? 1600 total damage to a board is something that not many decks can play around and will wipe everything short of a pedal player, because, Fox is fair. There are 3 support cards for Will of Despair. 2 of them are resonators and 1 is a chant. I'll get the chant out of the way first since it's pretty basic. Tell a Dark Fairy Tale lets you look at the top 4 cards of your deck, reveal a Will of Despair card, and then add it to your hand. While it sounds okay for a search card, it's actually pretty weak. Simply looking at the top 4 cards of your deck doesn't guarantee you'll get anything, and even worse is that whatever card you grab goes into your hand instead of the field. Search power and force of will rides a line between strong and awful based on what kind of advantage something gives you. Normally you want a body or some other kind of use out of your search card, and Tell a Dark Fairy Tale only replaces itself in hand, assuming it doesn't also whiff. The 2 resonator support cards are Melge's War Beast and Arla's Blackwing Guard. They both match the color of their respective bosses, and each gain some kind of bonus if you control a Will of Despair resonator. A simple skill that they both lack. This means you can't run them in Darkbook unless you have their respective colors in your deck. White and red aren't exactly powerhouse colors right now, and not much from them synergizes well with the rest of the Will of Despair package. There's also the fact that there are plenty of cards that outweigh these 2 in terms of cost efficiency. Okay, on to deck ideas. You can run Will of Despair in just about whatever way you want. Darkbook provides will fixing for playing your resonators, so you only have to worry about making sure your spell base supports what you want to do. Unless, of course, you want to splash in resonators that aren't Will of Despair. I find that green-black or mono-green are probably the strongest options you have. Will of Despair has some of the best swiftness resonators currently available, and Dark Book lets you mix in other options like Vengolf Little Red, who is probably the strongest swiftness resonator this game has ever printed. You can also go straight aggro with green and red to have access to things like Madbor, Freyla, or Maria Bella. If you enjoy turning things to the right when you play them, then give this kind of deck a try. Wind has a lot of utility spells that can help supplement your strategy in aggro, including pump, damage, and draw power. The sheer amount of beatdown Mono Book can provide is also substantial enough that many non-meta decks can't handle it before things get pushed past a point of no return. Dark Book is also one of the only aggro decks that has a reliable backup plan in case something happens. If you lose your field, all you need to do is sit back, control, try to get to 7 stones, put a mirror on the field, and you're back in the game. The only problem is that 7 will cost, so you either need to have an actual decent stall game or access to ramp, which are both things green can do for you. You'll mostly see Will of Despair cards as additions to other decks due to their strong effects rather than all in one deck. Many of them have been meta-defining since their release, and a few of them have ended up as cards to disrupt specific strategies. Viable aggro decks are kind of a rarity in the game now, and it's nice to see that one can still hold its own against a lot of the other tougher decks out there. The amount of customization you can get from fixing your resonators encourages a good amount of creativity, and I feel that Dark Book put this to better use than almost any other will-fixing ruler currently in the game.